In the midst of a scrapyard, a homeless girl stumbled upon an unconscious man. His clothes were expensive, his face unfamiliar, yet something about him seemed too vulnerable for someone of his apparent wealth. She had no idea who he was or why he was there, but as she knelt beside him, something inside her stirred. Who was this man, and why did he need her help? If this story stirs something in you, consider sticking with us. Like, share, and leave a comment, because sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the greatest transformations. Mia had always known the streets of Atlanta like the back of her hand. She had to. Life had never offered her much else. The flickering neon lights of the downtown district, the cold cement beneath her bare feet, and the harsh whispers of a city that barely noticed her were all she could rely on. She had seen the wealthy walk by, their heads held high, their smiles as perfect as their tailored suits. But she had never felt a part of their world. And yet, today, something was different. She had been walking past an old scrapyard near the outskirts of the city, her stomach growling with hunger. The piles of discarded metal, rusted tools, and broken-down cars made her feel even more invisible than usual. It was then she saw him, Victor Grant. At first, Mia thought he was just another forgotten figure lying among the junk, but the way he lay, his body twisted unnaturally, told a different story. He wasn't just asleep or drunk, something was wrong. His breath was shallow, and his face was pale, almost lifeless. Mia's instincts kicked in. Despite her skepticism of the rich and powerful, something in her stirred. She couldn't just walk away. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. Her voice was shaky as she described the scene, but even as she spoke, she could feel a sense of urgency growing in her chest. This was no longer about a chance encounter. It was a moment that might change everything. As the paramedics arrived, Mia watched the scene unfold, her heart racing. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? But why did it feel so wrong? Why did she feel like something was about to unravel that she wasn't prepared for? She couldn't shake the feeling that this decision, this one act of kindness, would lead to something far more complicated than she could imagine. Just as the paramedics were loading Victor into the ambulance, a sleek black car pulled up. From it emerged a woman, older than Mia, with an air of quiet authority. She was dressed in an immaculate suit, her face a mask of concern. Alice, the housekeeper, Mia later learned, walked toward the scene with a purposeful stride. She stood there for a moment, observing the commotion, then turned to Mia with a look that Mia couldn't quite place. Was it gratitude, disappointment? Mia's heart skipped a beat as Alice's eyes met hers. There was something in her gaze that felt off. Alice didn't say anything, just nodded curtly before heading back to the car. Mia stood frozen, the weight of the woman's stare lingering long after she had gone. What had she just gotten herself into? Cliffhanger, Mia watched the car drive off, wondering if this was the last time she would see any of these people. What had she done? And was it a mistake to save Victor Grant? Mia couldn't get the image of Victor Grant out of her mind. After she had called the ambulance and seen him taken away, she thought that would be the end of it. She had done the right thing. He was just another wealthy man, another part of a world she didn't belong to. Yet, the moment she had dialed those 3 numbers, her life had become tangled in a way she couldn't easily untangle. It had felt like fate, but it was also frightening. Now, as she wandered the streets of Atlanta, once again alone and forgotten, Mia wondered if she had done enough, or if her involvement had opened a door to something far bigger than she could comprehend. Back in the dilapidated apartment she called home, where the smell of old food and damp walls clung to her skin, Mia tried to push the thoughts of Victor away. The world outside was a stark contrast to her own reality. She had no one, no safety net, just the cold concrete and the harsh lights of the city that barely noticed her. Yet, even as she moved through her routines, trying to find odd jobs here and there, figuring out how to get her next meal, Victor's face haunted her thoughts. She had helped him, but why she had never done something like that before, not for someone who lived a life so different from her own. Meanwhile, Victor was far from at peace. The moment he regained consciousness in the hospital, his mind kept racing back to that alley, to the girl who had helped him, who had been the first person to show him any sort of care when he'd been vulnerable. He had lived a life full of luxury, power, and detachment, but Mia had been raw, honest. The disparity between them was impossible to ignore, but something about her sincerity lingered in his mind. He wasn't sure if he should be grateful or unsettled by the way she had acted without asking anything in return. It felt like he owed her something. Victor tried to focus on his recovery, to return to his life, but he found himself asking why he was letting this young girl, someone from a world he had long since forgotten, affect him so deeply. In an attempt to push the thoughts aside, he threw himself into his work, his empire, the cold, calculating world that had always been his comfort zone. But Mia's face kept drifting into his thoughts, uninvited. It was Alice, his loyal housekeeper, who broke the silence. She had been going through some paperwork when she came across a photo that caught her eye. It was an old picture of Victor with a group of people at one of his charity events. But there, standing off to the side, was Mia. Alice wasn't sure how to react. There was something unsettling about this photograph. She had never seen Mia at any of Victor's events before, but she had clearly been there. Alice's suspicion grew as she wondered about the connection between the two. What had Victor's involvement with this girl been? A few days passed, and Mia was trying to shake off her own growing unease. Why had she felt so compelled to help Victor, and why was she still thinking about him? He was a wealthy man, with a life far removed from hers. They should have never crossed paths. She pushed the thoughts away until her phone buzzed. It was a simple text from an unfamiliar number, but when she saw the name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was Victor. He had texted her, just to ask how she was doing. No formalities, just a genuine question. "Hey, Mia, just wanted to check in. How are you holding up?" Mia stood there for a moment, her thumb hovering over the phone screen. She hadn't expected this. She had no idea why he would reach out to her now. After all, he was a billionaire, and she was just a girl who lived in a rundown apartment. Still, there was something comforting in his message. It wasn't the typical cold, transactional language she had come to expect from the people of his world. It felt different. She didn't know what to say. How was she supposed to respond? She had never been in a position like this before. The people she interacted with were not the type to reach out just for the sake of it. And yet, here was Victor Grant, reaching out with no agenda, just concern. Cliffhanger. Mia typed a reply, then stopped. She had no idea what this would lead to, and part of her felt she shouldn't even engage with him. But there was something about him, something that made her want to take the risk. She pressed send, not knowing what would happen next. The ballroom was grand, a perfect reflection of the lives of the people who filled it. Crystal chandeliers hung above, casting soft, golden light over polished floors, where expensive shoes clicked and echoed with the sounds of quiet laughter and hushed conversations. Mia, standing near the back of the room, felt as if she were standing in a world she could never belong to, a world that was alien to her very being. She had no place here, no voice that would be heard, but she had to be here. Victor had invited her to attend this charity event, a gala meant to raise funds for a community project he had begun. He had called it the right thing to do, but it felt more like a spectacle. Mia couldn't ignore the fact that every glance seemed to dismiss her as an outsider, a curiosity. Her faded dress, her unpolished shoes, the bruises that still marked her from a life lived on the streets, none of it belonged here. She could feel the eyes on her, the whispers that didn't reach her ears but were clearly meant for her. She had known this feeling her whole life, but it never felt more pronounced than right now. The more she tried to adjust to the room's etiquette, the more out of place she felt. She wanted to leave, wanted to vanish. But there was something in the way Victor had asked her to come, something different from his usual detached kindness. He seemed genuine, almost too much so, and that confused her. Why would someone like him, a man of power, of wealth, want anything to do with someone like her? As the evening wore on, Mia's discomfort only grew. She tried to blend in, smiling politely when someone spoke to her, but it felt as if she were wearing a mask that didn't quite fit. It wasn't just the stares or the whispered remarks, it was the air of superiority, the obvious divide between the guests in their tuxedos and gowns, and her, an awkward, uninvited guest in the corner. The more she moved through the room, the more she felt like an intruder, a fly on a gilded wall. But as she moved closer to the refreshment table, she saw him. Victor. He was standing alone, his face serious, but his eyes scanning the crowd as if he were searching for someone. When his gaze landed on her, Mia felt a shiver run down her spine. It was a look of recognition, but also something more, something Mia couldn't quite place. He made his way toward her, weaving through the crowd with an ease that came from a lifetime of knowing he belonged. Mia stood rooted to the spot, unsure of what she should do. Victor finally stopped in front of her, his posture relaxed, but his eyes focused. He didn't say anything immediately. Instead, he just studied her. Mia, uncomfortable under the weight of his gaze, shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She had to force herself not to look away. "You're not like anyone I've ever met," Victor finally said, his voice low but clear, as if his words had weight. His tone was direct, no pretense in it. For a moment, Mia felt exposed, vulnerable under his scrutiny. She wasn't sure how to respond. It was the kind of comment that could easily be mistaken for pity, but something in the way he said it made her pause. Was he really seeing her? Or was this just another polite observation from someone who lived in a world so distant from hers? Mia could feel the weight of the statement press against her chest. She had been called many things in her life, strange, different, out of place, but never like this. There was no judgment in his eyes, no hint of superiority, just curiosity, perhaps even something more genuine. Her heart beat a little faster as she tried to find the right words. She wanted to say something, something sharp, something that would make him understand her world, her struggle, but instead, she simply nodded, offering a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm just here for the cause," she said quietly, her voice barely above the noise of the room. Victor's lips curved upward in a slight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I think you're here for more than that," he replied softly, almost as if he had uncovered a truth Mia hadn't even realized herself. There was an awkward silence between them, the distance between their worlds palpable. Mia felt herself retreating, feeling like she was sinking into the ground beneath her feet. Why had she agreed to come here? What had she hoped to find? She knew the answer, but couldn't bring herself to admit it. She didn't belong here, not in this room, not with these people. Victor seemed to sense her discomfort. He stepped back slightly, but his gaze never left her. "You don't have to stay here," he said, his voice not offering pity, but something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. "You don't have to pretend to fit in." Mia shook her head, her heart racing as she glanced around the room again. "I don't have to fit in," she said, her voice firmer this time. "But I need to be here, for the cause, for the people who need help." For a moment, Victor just watched her, his face unreadable. Then he nodded, as if understanding something about her that she hadn't said aloud. Cliffhanger. As Mia turned to leave, she overheard a hushed conversation between two guests behind her, their voices barely audible. "Did you hear they say Victor's been spending a lot of time with her? That girl from the street? Why?" The question lingered in the air, hanging heavy with judgment. Mia felt her stomach drop. Was this what they thought of her? Was she just a spectacle for them to gossip about? Victor Grant sat in his office in Buckhead, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. The skyline was lit up with the glow of 1,000 lights, but his mind was far from the view. Instead, his thoughts were consumed by Mia, the girl from the streets of Atlanta, whose face had become a constant presence in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her than just a random act of kindness, a momentary brush with someone who needed help. But what troubled him the most was the connection he had just begun to realize. The night Mia had saved him, when he had been lying unconscious in that scrapyard, had felt like the start of a strange dream. He had been so out of it, barely aware of what was happening around him, yet somewhere in the haze of his memories, he remembered her eyes wide with concern, yet strangely composed, as if she had seen more of life's hardships than most people ever would. That was the first thing that unsettled him. She was different from everyone he knew, from his world. But it wasn't until today, as he sifted through old charity event photos in his office, that he saw the photo that sent a ripple through him. There she was again, in the background of a photo from one of his family's charity galas, standing with a group of people. She was younger, of course, but it was her. And then it clicked. The realization that had been slowly creeping up on him, Mia wasn't a stranger. He had met her before. More than that, he had unknowingly been part of a significant moment in her life. Victor ran his fingers through his hair, the photograph in his hand suddenly heavy with meaning. He had been too young to realize it back then, but this was the moment that had altered the course of Mia's life. That memory came rushing back: his father's charity events, his mother's impeccable social gatherings, and Mia, standing among the crowd, her face in the background like a forgotten note. But she hadn't been forgotten. She had been there, in the periphery, caught up in a world she never asked for. He had unknowingly been part of a system that had failed her long before they ever crossed paths in the scrapyard. Mia, he muttered to himself. He thought back to their brief conversation at the charity event, the words he had spoken to her, the way she had looked at him, confused and distant. He had tried to brush it off, but now it felt like the weight of it all was too much to ignore. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Alice, the housekeeper, entered without waiting for a response. She had a clipboard in her hand, but her eyes were focused on him with a certain intensity. "You're still thinking about her, aren't you?" Alice's voice was soft, but knowing. She had been working for the Grants for over 2 decades and had seen more of Victor's personal life than most. She could tell when something was bothering him. Victor didn't answer at first, just continued staring out the window. He could feel Alice's eyes on him, waiting for him to say something. He finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "I think I've known her longer than I realized." Alice set the clipboard down on his desk and folded her arms. "You've met her before, haven't you?" she asked, her tone almost too casual, as if she had known all along. Victor didn't answer right away. He didn't want to, didn't know how to explain it. "I was too young to remember," he said finally, his voice rough. "But I should have known. I should have paid attention." Alice raised an eyebrow. "Victor, you can't keep carrying this around with you. If she means something to you, then you need to figure out what that is. You can't keep living in the past, trying to fix things that aren't your fault." Her words hit harder than he expected. He had always respected Alice's wisdom, but now it felt like she was pushing him to confront something he wasn't ready to face. She was right. He had spent so much of his life trying to escape his family's shadow, trying to distance himself from the legacy of wealth and power. Yet he was now inextricably tied to Mia's past, to her struggles. Victor looked at Alice, his expression guarded. "I'm not sure what to do with this, Alice. I don't even know how she's going to react if I tell her the truth." Alice's gaze softened. "You have to trust yourself, Victor. You're not the same person you were. But Mia, she's been through things you can't even imagine. If there's a chance for you two to help each other, you have to take it. But don't wait too long." Victor sighed deeply. He knew Alice was right. He had to make a choice, but it wasn't going to be easy. He had lived a life of comfort, of privilege, but Mia had seen a side of the world he had tried to ignore. And now, they were connected in a way that neither of them could escape. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text message from Mia, just checking in. "Hope everything's okay with you." His heart skipped a beat. She had reached out to him again. He had thought about her constantly, but now, after everything that had come to light, he wasn't sure if he should tell her the truth. Could he really be honest with her, Would she ever look at him the same way again if she knew the truth about their past cliffhanger? He stared at the message, his finger hovering over the reply button. What was he supposed to say to her now? Could he face the consequences of his past mistakes? Mia had never thought much about charity. Growing up, it was a word that seemed distant, almost like a concept from a world far removed from hers. But here she was, standing alongside Victor Grant, working on a community project. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a small effort to provide food and supplies for children living in underprivileged neighborhoods. Victor, the wealthy man who had once seemed so out of reach, was standing beside her, his sleeves rolled up, carrying boxes of donations. For a brief moment, Mia wondered what kind of man he really was. At first, it had been difficult for her to accept his involvement. She had seen men like him before, the ones who gave for a tax break or a public image boost, not out of genuine concern. But the way Victor worked alongside her, getting his hands dirty without hesitation, told her something different. He wasn't just showing up for a photo op, he was actually trying to make a difference. And for the first time, Mia began to see him not as a millionaire, but as someone who cared about the people around him. They worked well together, moving from one task to another, talking to the children, helping them pick out clothes, and organizing food drives. The days were long, but they were filled with moments that allowed Mia to feel something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of purpose. For once, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't just another person passing through a world that didn't notice her. She was contributing, just like the people around her, and it felt good. But even in those moments, she could feel the gap between her and Victor. His world was so different from hers, and though he had made an effort to be here, to help, there was still a part of him that kept his distance. It wasn't something that was obvious, but Mia noticed it. The way he sometimes avoided eye contact when they spoke, the way he never mentioned his life outside of these small acts of charity. He was kind, but there was a wall he had built around himself, and Mia couldn't help but wonder why. That afternoon, while they were taking a break, Mia found herself sitting on a bench, watching the children play. The sun had started to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the park. She felt tired, but content. Victor sat beside her, his posture relaxed, but he still seemed distant in a way she couldn't quite place. She turned to look at him, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was a brief flicker of something in his gaze, curiosity, perhaps, but before she could read it. He looked away. "Why do you do it?" Mia asked, her voice soft but clear. "Why help people like us?" Victor was quiet for a long time, and Mia thought he might not answer. She turned her head to look at the children again, but he spoke up, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know. Maybe because it's the only thing that feels real." Mia nodded slowly, understanding more than he knew. She hadn't asked for his reasons, but now that he had shared them, something inside her shifted. She didn't see him as just a millionaire anymore, someone trying to absolve his guilt with charity. In that moment, she saw him as a man who, despite everything, was searching for something genuine in a world that often didn't offer that. Twist Mia had never spoken about her past to anyone. It wasn't something she ever wanted to share, but sitting there with Victor, the words came to her before she could stop them. Maybe it was the quiet of the evening, the calmness of the moment, or maybe it was the way Victor seemed to understand more than she had given him credit for. "My mom died when I was young," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I was just a kid when it happened. She worked hard to give me everything she could, but in the end, it wasn't enough. I had to grow up fast. And after she was gone, everything fell apart. I had no one." Victor was silent for a long time, but when he spoke, his voice was low and filled with an understanding she hadn't expected. "I didn't know," he said. "I can't imagine what that must have been like for you." For the first time, Mia didn't feel like she was being pitied. There was no sympathy in his voice, no condescension, only genuine empathy. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her feel less alone. Hook in that quiet moment, Mia saw Victor in a new light. He wasn't just the man who had money and influence. He was someone who saw her for who she was, not for what she lacked. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel something other than doubt. She felt understood. Cliffhanger. As Mia sat there, trying to absorb the weight of their conversation, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A group of people, dressed in suits, were walking toward them. They seemed to be watching Victor closely, their conversation muted but intense. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just here for the charity event. Something else was going on. And for the first time, she wondered if she had walked into a world she wasn't ready for. Victor had always been a man of action when it came to business. He was known for his sharp decisions, quick thinking, and precise moves. But when it came to helping others, especially in a tangible way, he realized how little experience he had. That changed when Mia entered his life. Slowly, he found himself drawn into more than just writing checks for charity events or handing out donations. Mia had a way of pulling him into the real, raw side of giving. It started with small steps, helping out at a local shelter, volunteering at food drives, and even donating time to help kids with their studies. But the turning point came when Mia asked him to help at a school in one of the poorest neighborhoods of Atlanta. The school had a broken projector and no way to repair it. They needed someone who could fix it, and for some reason, Mia thought of him. At first, Victor hesitated. He wasn't a mechanic. He wasn't trained in fixing old equipment. But Mia didn't see any of those limitations. She simply saw someone who could help. So, despite his reservations, Victor agreed. They spent the entire afternoon together, huddled over the old projector in a dark classroom. They both got their hands dirty, working side by side, sharing a moment of frustration when things didn't work, followed by quiet satisfaction when they finally got it running again. Victor hadn't realized how much he needed this. The physicality of the work, the camaraderie, the feeling of helping in a way that was personal. It was something he hadn't experienced before. Mia's quiet laughter as she adjusted the projector screen brought him back to the present moment, grounding him in the simplicity of the task at hand. For the first time, he felt like he was truly doing something for someone, not just writing a check or showing up for an event to maintain his reputation. Mia, too, felt something shift. She'd never really worked with anyone in this way, certainly never someone like Victor. But there he was, not looking at her with pity or distance, but with genuine focus as they worked together. They didn't talk much while they were working, but the occasional glance between them told a story of mutual respect. For Mia, the discomfort that had always accompanied her interactions with people from Victor's world started to fade. He wasn't a stranger anymore. She didn't feel out of place with him. It was as if, in that small, dimly lit classroom, they had crossed an invisible line, one that separated their worlds, but which had now blurred. After they fixed the projector, they sat down together on the edge of the desk, tired but satisfied. The room was quiet, except for the distant hum of the school's air conditioning and the soft voices of the children outside. Victor glanced over at Mia, who was still catching her breath from the work. She had a small smile on her face, the first time he had seen her genuinely relaxed. It was a moment of quiet companionship, and for a second, it felt like they had known each other much longer than they really had. Victor reached into his pocket, pulling out a water bottle and offering it to Mia. She took it with a nod of thanks. For a moment, neither of them said anything, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, like they had found some kind of understanding, some kind of shared space between them. Victor looked at her with something he hadn't expected: admiration. He hadn't expected to feel so connected to Mia, of all people, someone from a completely different world. But as they sat there, amidst the worn-out desks and old classrooms, he realized something. It wasn't about their differences or the divide between their lives. It was about the way they had come together, without expectation, to make something work. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was just Victor Grant, the billionaire CEO. He was simply a man working alongside someone who had become more than just a stranger to him. Mia, too, felt the shift. As they sat there, she realized that for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel out of place. She had always felt like she didn't belong anywhere. But now, sitting beside Victor, sharing a moment of quiet after a day of hard work, she felt like she had finally found a space where she wasn't just the girl from the street. She was someone who could do something meaningful, who could help others, just like him. It wasn't about wealth or status, it was about the work. And for the first time, she felt like she was part of something real. After a few moments, Mia looked at Victor, her eyes meeting his. There was a flicker of something between them, something that neither of them could define, but both recognized. "That wasn't so bad," Mia said, her voice breaking the silence. Victor chuckled lightly, the sound warm and genuine. "Yeah, I guess I'm not as useless as I thought." His tone was light, but there was a deeper meaning to his words. It wasn't just about fixing a projector. It was about learning to work with someone from a different world, someone who had shown him that life wasn't all about money and power. Mia smiled. "You did well." For a brief moment, the tension that had always been between them seemed to fade, replaced by something new, something that felt like trust, or at least the beginning of it. Hook, but as they stood up to leave, Mia noticed a familiar face in the crowd. A friend from her past, someone who had seen her struggle and had been a part of the life she had left behind. The friend was looking at her, then at Victor, with a curious expression. Cliffhanger. "What's going on with you two?" The question came out of nowhere, cutting through the moment like a knife. It was simple, yet it hung in the air, a subtle challenge to everything that had been building between Mia and Victor. Mia stiffened, her heart racing. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the world to know what was happening between them, or if they even knew what was happening themselves. Victor, too, looked over at the friend, his expression unreadable. Mia could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. What would they think? What would this mean for everything they had worked so hard to build? The invitation to the gala was a turning point for both Mia and Victor. What started as a simple act of kindness, a way for Victor to help someone less fortunate, had grown into something more complicated. The more time they spent together, the more their lives began to intertwine. What began with shared work projects for the community, late-night talks, and quiet moments of connection now began to stir up questions from people outside their small bubble. Victor's friends, family, and colleagues, people who had known him as the wealthy and often aloof businessman, began to notice the change in him. They whispered behind closed doors, their curiosity growing. Why was Victor, the man who had always kept to his own social circles, suddenly spending so much time with a young woman from the streets? At first, it was subtle, casual remarks here and there, but the whispers became more pointed. Mia wasn't oblivious. She had felt it from the very beginning, the way people looked at her, the way their gazes shifted whenever she entered a room with Victor. She wasn't one of them, and she knew it. She had lived her whole life with the knowledge that she didn't fit in with the wealthy, polished circles Victor moved in. But there was something about him, something that made her want to be close to him, despite their differences. She didn't expect anything from him, nor did she feel entitled to anything. But every time she saw him, heard his voice, shared a laugh, or even worked side by side, she felt like she was slowly moving out of the shadows and into the light. Victor had noticed, too. It wasn't just the way Mia had changed since he first met her. It was the way he had changed. He found himself looking forward to their time together, to the moments when they could leave the outside world behind and just be themselves, without expectations, without the weight of their respective roles. He could talk to her without worrying about how he was perceived, without the pressure of being the millionaire CEO. But the truth was, they couldn't remain in that bubble forever. The world outside their small, shared space was waiting, watching. One evening, after a long day of working together on yet another community project, Victor broached a subject that had been on his mind for a while. They were sitting in his office, the evening light filtering through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. Victor's usual composure was softened that night, the stiff lines of his expensive suit giving way to a more relaxed demeanor. "Mia," he began, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. "I've been thinking about something." Mia looked up from the papers she had been sorting through, her eyes meeting his. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated for a moment, running a hand through his hair before speaking again. "I've invited you to help with a lot of things, and I think it's time you see more of what I do, more of my world." He paused, trying to gauge her reaction. Mia blinked in surprise, her heart skipping a beat. The invitation wasn't what she had expected. For a moment, she felt a wave of excitement mixed with anxiety. Victor had always seemed distant, and now he was offering her a glimpse into the world he came from, a world that she had always viewed from the outside, a world of luxury, of elegance, a world where she had never belonged. Victor watched her closely, noticing the way her posture stiffened, the way she looked away for a brief moment as if weighing the offer. He knew she was hesitant. He could feel it. He had always been able to read people well, especially when they didn't want to reveal their true feelings. "You don't have to come if you don't want to," he added quickly, trying to soften the offer. "But I think it might be good for you to see more of the world I live in. You deserve to know what's out there." Mia swallowed hard, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this, for what it would mean for her. She had spent her whole life avoiding people like Victor, people who had everything and could never understand what it was like to struggle. She wasn't sure if she could fit into his world, but she also couldn't deny the part of her that wanted to try. "I don't know if I belong in your world," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I fit in there." Victor reached out and touched her arm lightly, his touch warm but reassuring. "You don't have to fit in, but I think you deserve to see it for yourself, to make your own judgment." Mia felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had spent so many years feeling like an outsider, not just in Victor's world, but in any world that wasn't her own. She had never been given the chance to make her own choices, to decide for herself where she fit. And here was Victor, offering her that chance. But what if she wasn't ready? What if she wasn't enough? For a moment, she looked at him, her heart pounding. She wanted to say yes, to take the plunge and see what would happen. But there was a fear inside her, a fear of the unknown, of the judgment she might face. She had spent so much of her life hiding from the world, afraid of what it would think of her. Cliffhanger. "I'll think about it," Mia said finally, standing up and gathering her things. She couldn't bring herself to give him a clear answer yet. The invitation hung in the air, unresolved, a reminder of the distance between their worlds. She turned to leave, but just before she stepped out the door, she heard Victor's voice again. "Mia," he called softly. She turned to face him one last time. "No matter what you decide, just know, I'm not asking you to change. I'm asking you to be yourself." His words lingered in her mind as she walked out, and for the first time, she wasn't sure what to feel. She didn't know what her answer would be, but she knew that this decision, whatever it was, would change everything. Mia had always known that the world she lived in was different. It wasn't just the crumbling walls of the shelter or the dark alleys that she called home. It was the way people looked at her, the way she always seemed to be on the outside, watching others from a distance. She was used to being overlooked, to fading into the background. But now, for the first time, she was in a world that was completely alien to her. The evening had started innocuously enough. Victor had invited her to a charity gala, a part of his ongoing push to give back to the community. He had assured her that it would be a small, informal event. But as they approached the venue, Mia quickly realized just how wrong that assumption had been. The building was enormous, a gleaming symbol of wealth and privilege. The valet opened the door to the limo, and as Mia stepped out, she felt the eyes of everyone in the vicinity turn toward her, the flashing lights from the paparazzi cameras, the whispered conversations, the elegantly dressed people who seemed to glide through the room. It was overwhelming. Mia was out of place. She knew it the moment she entered. The high-ceilinged ballroom with its crystal chandeliers, the marble floors, and the polished silverware, it all felt like something out of a dream. She could feel the coldness of the polished surface beneath her heels, the strange tension in her gut. As Victor walked beside her, his tall frame cutting through the crowds effortlessly, Mia couldn't help but feel like she was trailing behind, like an imposter in a world that didn't belong to her. She clutched the edge of her dress, a simple thing compared to the expensive gowns surrounding her. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she forced herself to straighten her back. The air felt heavy with expectation, and she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was silently judging her, questioning why someone like her was here. Victor seemed to sense her discomfort. "Don't worry," he said softly, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. "No one's going to bite. Just relax." Mia nodded, but it didn't help. She could hear the soft murmur of voices around her, the polite yet distant smiles from the other guests. They were polite, but there was a barrier one Mia couldn't break through. No matter how much Victor reassured her, no matter how often he told her that everything was fine, the gulf between their worlds was undeniable. As the evening wore on, Mia found herself slipping into the background, standing by the large windows, watching the world outside. Her heart was heavy, weighed down by the distance she felt between herself and the people around her. She had never belonged in a place like this. But Victor, despite everything, had insisted that she come, that she experience this world. She felt a wave of gratitude toward him for trying to include her, but it only deepened the sense of alienation she felt. How could she ever truly belong here? How could she ever be a part of a world that was so fundamentally different from her own? The people here didn't know what it was like to scrape by, to wonder where the next meal was coming from, to survive off of scraps. The distance between their lives, their experiences, it felt like a chasm too wide to bridge. Just as she was beginning to retreat further into herself, a small hand tugged at her sleeve. Mia turned, surprised to see a little girl standing there, holding a piece of paper. "Hi, I drew you," the girl said shyly, holding out a crayon drawing. Mia took the paper and looked at the picture. It was a simple drawing of her, standing tall with a smile on her face, surrounded by what looked like stars. She could see the love and admiration in the child's eyes. For the first time that evening, Mia felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling that wasn't tied to the grandeur around her. The child saw her, saw who she was, not what she lacked or where she came from. Victor, who had been standing a few feet away, watched the interaction. His eyes softened as he saw Mia's face light up, the tension easing from her posture. There was something pure about the way she responded to the child. It wasn't just the act of receiving a drawing, it was the way Mia allowed herself to be vulnerable, to open up to something so simple and genuine. It was the first time all night that Mia seemed to belong to something, even if it was just for a moment. "Mia," Victor said softly, stepping closer. "You know, this whole night is about people like you, people who might not have everything, but who are willing to make a difference, people who have the power to inspire." Mia looked up at him, but she didn't know how to respond. She had been fighting all evening to fit in, to feel like she wasn't an outsider. And now, here he was, talking about her like she was something more than just a girl from the streets. It made her feel both humble and uncomfortable, like she was being put on a pedestal she didn't deserve. Victor could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the way she pulled back into herself. He didn't push her, though. He simply smiled gently and nodded. "You belong here. Mia, don't ever doubt that." For the first time that night, Mia wasn't sure if she agreed, but she also knew that she didn't want to leave. Despite the differences between them, despite the walls that seemed to separate their worlds, there was something there, a connection, something deeper than the surface level of wealth and status. As she stood there, still holding the child's drawing, a question gnawed at her. The name Rivera had been mentioned earlier in a conversation she overheard. It was a name tied to Victor's business dealings, a name that had come up in connection with his family. Mia's heart sank as she realized that the name sounded familiar, too familiar. Rivera. Could it be, she thought to herself, trying to piece together the fragmented information. Had Victor's family been involved in something from her past? Was there more to him than just the man she had come to know? Her thoughts were interrupted when she felt a hand on her shoulder. Victor's warm voice broke through the whirlwind of doubts. "Hey, you okay?" Mia nodded, but inside, a storm was brewing. She had questions she didn't know how to ask, and answers she wasn't sure she was ready for. Mia had always suspected that there was more to Victor than what met the eye. From the very first day they had met, something about him seemed familiar, yet elusive. The more time they spent together, the more she began to sense a connection, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. But as she sat in the corner of the quiet office, sifting through papers for the community project they were working on, that connection started to feel more like a thread unraveling. It was a small, unremarkable folder tucked away in the corner of Victor's office. It had been left behind when they were organizing the documents for their new charity initiative. But there, in the middle of the pile, was something that caught Mia's attention. A photograph. It was an old black and white picture, yellowed with age. At first, it seemed just like another family photo or a casual snapshot from one of Victor's many business ventures. But as she looked closer, her heart skipped a beat. In the picture was a man Mia had not seen in years, but whose face she would never forget. The man in the photograph was her father. She had only seen a few pictures of him after he had passed, but this was one she had never come across before. He was smiling, standing beside a much younger Victor, both of them dressed in suits, sharing a moment that looked too carefree to be anything other than the prelude to disaster. Her father had been a victim of a bitter land dispute, one that Mia had never fully understood as a child, but which had left her family broken and struggling. She'd grown up with the scars of that battle, the bitterness, the mistrust, the loss. The image before her now seemed like a direct link between her father's demise and Victor's rise to power. It was as if Mia had stumbled upon a puzzle piece she hadn't even realized was missing. Mia's breath caught in her throat. She stood up suddenly, the photograph slipping from her hand and falling to the floor with a soft thud. Her mind was reeling. Everything she had thought she knew about Victor, the kindness, the generosity, the sense of connection she had felt, was now clouded by this discovery. Her father's death had been a turning point for her family, a chapter of suffering that she could never fully reconcile. And now, to see Victor's face next to her father's, it felt like a betrayal. She couldn't breathe. Her stomach twisted into knots, and the walls of the room seemed to close in on her. How could she have been so naive? How could she have been so blind to the possibility that the man who had offered her a glimpse of a better life might have been the very same one who helped tear hers apart? Victor had always seemed like the kind of man who understood what it was like to struggle, to fight against the odds. Yet, now Mia realized that he had likely played a role in the suffering her family had endured. How much of this was intentional, how much of it had been out of his control, but none of that mattered in the moment. All that mattered was the fact that she had uncovered a connection between their two worlds that was impossible to ignore. The man who had reached out to her was the same man who might have indirectly caused the pain she had spent her entire life trying to escape. She needed to confront him. Mia's steps were quick and sharp as she walked out of the office, the picture still lying abandoned on the floor. She found Victor in the grand, quiet living room of the house, a space that always felt more like a museum than a home. He stood by the window, looking out over the sprawling view of the city, his back turned to her. "Mia," he said without turning, his voice smooth but distant, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice trembled slightly as the words left her mouth. "Why didn't you tell me that you knew him? My father. Why didn't you tell me you knew my father?" Victor turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way he stood that made Mia's heart race. There was no anger in his eyes, only confusion. "I never wanted you to know," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving hers. "It wasn't my place." Mia's mind buzzed with questions. "You knew him. You knew what happened to him, but you didn't tell me. You didn't think I should know that the man who ruined my family could be the same one who's been helping me." Victor's face tightened. "Mia, you're wrong," he said, stepping closer. "It wasn't like that. I had no part in what happened to your father. I was a different man back then. I didn't know how much your family had suffered, but you were part of it. You were there. You were with him, standing by his side in that picture, at the same time that he was ruining my life." Mia's voice cracked, her emotions getting the better of her. "How could you do that? How could you be standing next to him, pretending like nothing was wrong?" Victor's eyes softened, but there was still a sense of guilt in them. "I never wanted to hurt you, Mia. I never wanted you to find out this way." But Mia didn't want to hear it. She couldn't. The truth was too painful. The man who had brought her into this world, the one who had been so kind, had also been a part of the system that had destroyed her family. The knowledge twisted inside her chest, making it hard to breathe. "You don't get it," she whispered, stepping back. "I thought you were different, but now I know you're just like everyone else." The silence hung heavy in the room, and Victor seemed to shrink under her words. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Mia shook her head, unable to listen anymore. "I have to go," she said, her voice small but resolute. "I can't do this. I need to get away from you." Victor stood motionless, unable to find the right words. The space between them felt wider than ever. And for the first time, Mia felt as if all the warmth and kindness he had shown her was a lie. As she turned to leave, she felt the weight of his gaze on her back, but she couldn't bring herself to turn around. The truth had shattered something inside her, and she wasn't sure if it could ever be fixed. "You are the son of the man who destroyed my family," she whispered to herself, as if speaking the words aloud might make the reality of them sink in. The final blow had landed, and Mia knew, in that moment, that things would never be the same. Mia tried to escape the truth. The reality of what she had uncovered about Victor weighed heavily on her chest, but it wasn't something she wanted to confront. Every time she thought about it, the sharp edge of betrayal cut through her thoughts. Yet every time she pushed it away, a lingering question remained. Was Victor truly the man she had come to care for, or was he the same person responsible for tearing her family apart? She tried to return to the simplicity of her life, working hard at the community center, spending time with the children she helped, and keeping herself distracted by the daily grind. But nothing could erase the feeling that something had changed. It was like trying to ignore the elephant in the room. No matter how much she busied herself, she couldn't shake the image of Victor, the man who had quietly taken responsibility for past mistakes, even if it meant facing his own uncomfortable truths. Days passed, and the walls she had built around herself grew higher, yet they weren't enough to stop the reality from creeping in. Victor didn't try to confront her again, but his presence was ever so apparent. It wasn't in the way he spoke to her, it was in the small, seemingly insignificant actions he took. He had started showing up at places where Mia's family had once suffered, offering donations to her mother's medical bills, sending anonymous support to the local shelter Mia had once called home. And though Mia never saw him do any of this, she felt his quiet hand in the healing process. Victor wasn't making grand gestures, wasn't offering apologies that would have been easy to dismiss as insincere. He was, in his own way, repairing the wrongs that had never been acknowledged. His silence was deafening, yet it spoke volumes to her. But Mia still resisted. She couldn't understand why he was doing this. Was this all just some form of guilt? Was this his way of trying to win her back? It didn't feel like that. There was something different in his actions, something more profound that Mia couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't about love or redemption, it was about responsibility, about trying to right a wrong that was long past. One afternoon, as Mia sat on a bench at the community center, the sun shining down on her, she heard a familiar voice behind her. She turned to see her mother, her face a mixture of concern and weariness. "Mom," Mia asked, standing up quickly. "Is everything all right?" Her mother handed her a piece of paper, a message that had arrived earlier that morning. The note was simple, the handwriting unfamiliar, but unmistakably Victor's. "He came by today," her mother said, her voice low. "He didn't apologize. Mia. But he left everything that your father would have deserved. No strings attached, just enough to help." Mia's hands trembled as she read the note. The message wasn't one of apology or regret. It was cold, clinical in its simplicity. It wasn't a romantic gesture or a public display of remorse. It was just Victor taking action, making things right in the only way he knew how. The words on the paper blurred as she thought back to everything she had learned about him, his past, his role in her father's life, the connections they both shared. There were too many layers to their story, too many complex emotions to sift through. "What does this mean?" Mom Mia asked, her voice soft, hesitant. She didn't know what to feel. She didn't know if she should be angry or relieved. Her mother looked at her with a quiet understanding. "It means he's trying to make amends. Mia, he's not doing it for us. He's doing it for himself. Maybe he's trying to fix something broken inside him, but maybe—" She paused, looking at her daughter's confused face. "Maybe he's trying to show you that he's more than just what you think he is." Mia didn't know if she could believe that. She didn't know if she could accept this version of Victor, the man who had once been a stranger, the man who had unknowingly brought her into his world. Could someone change so drastically? Could someone so deeply connected to the past become someone worthy of trust? She wasn't sure. But there was a shift in her, a realization that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about forgiveness just yet. Maybe it wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about seeing him for who he was now, in this moment. The truth wasn't easy to swallow, but Mia knew that she couldn't continue running from it forever. There was no going back to the way things were. She had to make a choice, whether she would stay angry and bitter or choose to acknowledge the man Victor had become. As she read the note again, her mother's words echoed in her mind. Maybe he's trying to fix something broken inside him. Victor wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He was simply doing what he thought was right. And that, in itself, spoke volumes. Mia stood up, holding the note in her hand. She wasn't sure what to do with it just yet, but she knew one thing: she couldn't ignore it any longer. The silence between them was louder than any apology could ever be. The question remained, though, what would she do with it? Could she allow herself to trust him again? Could she let go of the past and walk forward into a future that felt uncertain, yet full of possibility? As she walked out of the community center, the weight of her thoughts heavy on her shoulders, Mia received another text. This time, it wasn't from Victor. It was from a mutual friend, one who had been watching the situation unfold. The message was simple and to the point: Victor's doing the right thing. Mia, maybe you should too. The words stung, but they were true. Maybe it was time to stop running from the past and start building something new. She didn't look back as she made her way toward home, but deep down, she knew something had changed. Victor sat across from Mia, his hands clasped tightly together, his shoulders hunched, as though the weight of what he was about to say had physically crushed him. The room between them felt colder than usual, despite the soft warmth from the sunlight pouring through the window. Mia, still unsure of how to read him, watched him carefully, her emotions swirling in confusion and anger. She wasn't sure what she expected him to say, but what came out of his mouth wasn't what she thought at all. "I need to tell you something," Victor began, his voice quiet but steady. "My father. He's the one who caused all of the pain in your family's life. Everything that happened to your father, your mother, and you, it was because of him." He paused, his gaze not meeting hers, but she could feel the weight of his confession. Mia's breath hitched, her heart pounded in her chest, the words he had just spoken like a knife, twisting deeper into the wound that had never fully healed. Her father's death, the years of hardship, the constant struggle, it all led back to Victor's father, a man who had never been held accountable. Yet here was Victor, sitting in front of her, admitting the truth she had always suspected, but never fully realized. Victor took a deep breath and continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't change what happened, Mia. I can't bring your father back, and I can't undo the damage my father caused, but I can change how I live. I can choose to be different from him. I know that might not mean anything to you, but I had to say it." Mia swallowed hard, the sting of tears behind her eyes. Her body trembled as the truth sank in. She had spent so many years holding on to her hatred for Victor, believing that he and his family were nothing more than the cause of her suffering. She had been so consumed with revenge, so certain that she would never forgive him, that hearing his confession felt like the world shifting beneath her. He was not the man she had built in her mind. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her thoughts were a mess, too many emotions, too many conflicting feelings. She wanted to yell, to scream at him for the pain his father had caused, to tell him how much she had suffered, how it had torn her family apart. But a part of her also understood what he was saying. He wasn't his father. He was trying to make things right, in his own quiet way. "You're not him," she finally managed to say, her voice shaky. "But it doesn't change everything that's happened. It doesn't change what you come from, what your family's done." The anger that had burned so hot in her chest was still there, but it had turned into something more complex, something that mixed with sorrow and frustration. Victor nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting that. "I know. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to forget. I just needed to tell you the truth. I don't want to be the man my father was. I'm not him, and I'm not going to follow in his footsteps." Mia stared at him for a long moment, the silence between them heavy. The confession hung in the air like a fragile thread, connecting them in a way that neither of them had anticipated. She had spent so long believing that the man in front of her was the enemy, the reason behind all her pain. And now he was admitting to a truth that was as much his burden as it had been hers. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, and he wasn't offering empty words of sympathy. He was simply laying out the facts, raw and vulnerable. He had made a choice to break free from the cycle that had haunted his family for generations. But Mia wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. "I'm still angry," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive what your father did to my family, but I don't hate you anymore. Yum." The words felt strange on her tongue, like they didn't belong to her, like they were something she had never expected to say. But there they were, the first step toward letting go of the anger she had carried for so long. Victor looked up at her then, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and sadness. He didn't speak, but the silence between them felt different, less suffocating. Mia could see that he understood. He understood that forgiveness didn't come easily, especially not after all that had happened. But he also understood that the door to any kind of relationship, be it friendship or something more, was now open, even if just a crack. She stood up, feeling a sudden weight lift off her shoulders. "I need time," she said, her voice steady despite the turbulence inside her. "Time to think, to process everything. But for now, I think this is enough." Victor nodded, standing up as well. He didn't argue, didn't push. He simply watched her, his gaze soft and understanding. "Take all the time you need, Mia. I'll be here when you're ready." Mia didn't look back as she walked out of the room, but something inside her shifted. She knew that her heart was still a mess, that she still had so much to sort through. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the crushing weight of hate. As she stepped out into the crisp evening air, Mia looked up at the sky, her mind racing with thoughts of what the future might hold. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know if forgiveness would ever come, but she was no longer carrying the burden of resentment, and that, in itself, felt like a small step toward healing. The sun was just beginning to set over the city, casting long shadows across the empty lot where once stood a dilapidated warehouse. Mia and Victor stood side by side, their eyes fixed on the transformation taking place before them. What had been a forgotten, run-down space was now slowly turning into something new, a community center. The old brick walls were being repainted, new windows installed, and the large outdoor space was slowly being transformed into a park with playground equipment for the children. The project they had started together was beginning to take shape, and with each passing day, the space became more vibrant, more alive. Mia had always believed that change could only come through grand gestures, heroic actions that shifted entire systems or overturned the course of history. But what she was seeing now was something far more profound, small, patient steps toward making a difference. She had spent so much of her life fighting against the systems that held her down, trying to survive in a world that had never seemed interested in her struggles. Now, standing next to Victor, a man who had once seemed so disconnected from her world, she realized that they were both in the process of creating something real, something that would last long after they were gone. Victor, too, felt the weight of their shared work. It wasn't just the act of helping others, it was the realization that he had changed. He was no longer the man who had only looked out for his own interests, stepping over others to climb higher in the world. This project, this space, this sense of community was something he had never known before, something that was slowly teaching him what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. As they worked side by side, they exchanged quiet conversations, their bond deepening in ways neither had expected. Mia had always been the one to lead, to push forward when things seemed impossible. But now, she found herself leaning on Victor in moments of doubt. He, in turn, was learning how to trust, how to be part of something beyond the world of high society he had always known. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," Mia said one afternoon, wiping the sweat from her forehead as she stepped back to admire the progress. Victor glanced over at her, his smile small but genuine. "Neither can I. But it feels right. It feels like we're actually making a difference." His words hung in the air, the simplicity of the sentiment, a stark contrast to the grandiose ambitions they had once harbored. But somehow, it felt more meaningful now, more real. They had begun with a single idea, creating a space for the children, a place where they could feel safe, learn, and grow. But as the center expanded, so did their vision. They decided to hold workshops on art, teach practical skills like coding, and offer services to the families in need. The once derelict building was slowly becoming a hub of activity, a place of hope for a community that had long been neglected. The most rewarding part, however, was not in the physical work they were doing. It was in the faces of the children, the way their eyes lit up when they saw the playground taking shape, or when they walked into the center for the first time. It was in the pride that filled Mia's chest when she saw Victor, a man who had once lived in a world of privilege and opulence, getting down on the floor to teach a group of kids how to play basketball. But the greatest reward came one evening, as they finished cleaning up after another long day of work. A small group of children came running up to them, their faces filled with excitement. "When is Mr. Ethan coming back?" one of the kids asked, his voice full of eagerness. Mia's heart fluttered at the question. "Mr. Ethan?" she asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. The boy nodded eagerly. "Yeah, he was helping us with the murals. We want him to come back and finish the paintings." Mia looked over at Victor, a smile tugging at her lips. It was a small moment, but it was one of the most important ones they had shared so far. It meant they weren't just creating a space. They were becoming part of something bigger. They were becoming part of the community. It wasn't just about the buildings or the programs. They were making an impact in ways they hadn't even realized. Victor's gaze softened as he looked at the children, and for the first time, he saw himself as part of their world, not just as an outsider trying to make amends for past wrongs. He was a teacher, a mentor, a friend, and he was needed. Mia turned back to the children, her voice gentle but firm. "He'll be back," she said, her smile warm, "and we'll make sure he finishes those murals." As the children ran off, Mia and Victor stood in the quiet that followed, their shared sense of accomplishment settling between them like a quiet but powerful force. "We've come a long way," Victor said, his voice quiet but filled with pride. Mia nodded, her heart full. "We have." But as they stood there, taking in the progress they had made, Mia couldn't help but wonder about the future. Could they really keep going like this? Could their work, this new chapter they were building, survive the test of time? Or would the challenges of their past catch up with them? Cliffhanger. The answer to her question came when she saw a familiar face in the crowd across the street. A figure who had once been part of her painful past, someone who had always been a reminder of everything she had fought against. What did this mean for them? Now Mia watched as the children gathered around the newly completed playground. Their laughter echoed through the air, bouncing off the freshly painted walls of the community center. She was standing beside Victor, as she had done so many times in the past few months, but today something felt different. It wasn't just the accomplishment they had achieved in transforming this part of the city. It was the subtle shift that had taken place between them. She could feel it in the air, in the way he glanced at her when they spoke, in the way he made sure she was always included in decisions. She couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but she had begun to let him into her life in a way that was almost impossible to reverse. She had spent so many years keeping people at arm's length, afraid to trust, afraid to let anyone get too close. The scars from her past were deep, too deep for anyone to understand, or so she had convinced herself. But Victor had been different. She had first met him with hesitation, anger, and a deep distrust of everything he represented. Yet now, as they worked side by side, building something for the community, something for children like the ones laughing nearby, Mia realized she had allowed him into a space in her heart that no one had ever touched before. "Look at them," Victor said, his voice a low murmur, his eyes following the children as they played. "We've done something good here." Mia nodded, her eyes still locked on the kids, but her mind was somewhere else, wandering through the maze of her emotions. She wasn't sure when, but at some point, she had stopped seeing him as just the man who had caused her family so much pain. He was now someone who had shown her a different side of the world, one she hadn't known existed, the side where people could care for others without expectation of something in return. As they stood there, the sun setting in the background, Mia's heart felt full in a way it hadn't in years. She had spent so long guarding herself against any form of connection, and now she was beginning to see how much that had held her back. She felt it in the way she laughed freely when Victor cracked a joke, in the way she allowed herself to be vulnerable in front of him, and even in the way she had come to rely on his presence in her life. He had become a constant, a reliable anchor in the sea of uncertainty that had defined her existence. But even as she stood beside him, there was a lingering uncertainty that she couldn't shake. There was still so much unresolved between them, so much of the past that had not been fully reckoned with. She couldn't ignore the fact that Victor's family, the people who had once torn her life apart, were still out there, still part of his world. She couldn't pretend that she was over everything, that the scars had magically healed because of a few good deeds. And then, in the middle of her thoughts, a voice broke through her reverie. "Mia," a young voice, called out from the group of children. It was one of the boys who had been helping with the painting earlier that day. "Hey, look, it's Daddy," he shouted, pointing excitedly toward Victor. The words hung in the air for a moment, long enough for Mia's heart to skip a beat. She felt her breath catch in her throat as every eye in the small crowd turned toward them. The children, the parents, even her own mother, everyone was watching. It was one of those moments that could only be described as a mix of awkwardness and surprise. Mia had never heard a child call Victor Daddy, not once. Her mind raced. Had they really become this close? Had she unknowingly let him in so far? The thought both warmed and terrified her. She had spent so long trying to protect herself from the people she cared about, but here she was, standing next to Victor, and the lines between her feelings and the reality of their relationship had become dangerously blurred. Victor chuckled nervously, a slight awkwardness in his posture as he crouched down to the child's level. "You must be mistaken," he said with a smile, but there was something in his eyes, something that told Mia he wasn't entirely uncomfortable with the idea. He was trying to deflect, but a part of her could see through the calm exterior. Mia smiled softly, her eyes meeting his briefly. There was a sense of understanding between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of something that was beginning to take shape. She knew they had crossed a line, whether they had meant to or not. The question now was how they would navigate the space between them, this new territory they were both hesitant to fully step into. As the child ran off to join his friends, Mia turned to Victor, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know, it's funny. I never thought this would happen." Victor gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Neither did I," he admitted, "but sometimes..." Things happen when you least expect them. Mia's heart softened at his words. Despite everything, despite the awkwardness of the moment, she realized that he was trying. He was trying in a way that spoke louder than any apology could. But as the evening continued and the light faded, a sense of unease settled over Mia. She hadn't anticipated how deeply the weight of that simple remark Daddy would affect her. She had always been the one to push people away, to distance herself from anything that might bring her closer to a painful reality. But here, in this moment, with Victor standing beside her, she realized something unsettling. She had never truly let go of the past. She had never forgiven him, not fully. Her heart was still heavy with the weight of the hurt he had caused. The question she faced now wasn't whether or not she cared for him, but whether she could ever truly move forward. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," she said softly, almost to herself, but loud enough for him to hear. Her voice was filled with the weight of everything unsaid between them. Victor's gaze softened. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Mia. I'm just asking you to let me show you who I am now." Mia swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The uncertainty of the moment, the rawness of her emotions, was almost too much to bear. But as she stood there, her hand brushing against Victor's, she knew something had shifted between them. She hadn't been ready for this. She hadn't been ready for him, for the changes he was bringing into her life, for the feelings that she couldn't control. But somehow, she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something worth holding on to. "I don't know when I started believing in you," Mia whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But I believe in you now." Victor didn't say anything. Instead, he simply reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture that spoke volumes. No more words were needed. As they stood there, the cool evening breeze swirling around them, Mia realized that this feeling of connection was more powerful than anything she had ever felt before. It was fragile, yes, and full of uncertainty, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't want to let go. The tension had been building for weeks now. Mia could feel it in the air. Every time she and Victor entered a room together, people were starting to notice them. Not just the children in the community, who were endlessly excited about the new projects they had helped bring to life, but the adults around them, particularly those closest to Victor, his friends, his colleagues, even his family. Everyone had begun asking questions. Mia had always prided herself on being able to stay out of the limelight, out of the reach of judgment and scrutiny. But Victor had dragged her, willingly or not, into a world where nothing was private, and everyone had an opinion. The media had caught on, and for the first time in her life, Mia was caught in the public eye. Every move they made was being watched, every word they spoke, analyzed, and Mia, with her quiet life of hardship and obscurity, wasn't sure she was ready for it. It had been only a month since the first major community project they completed, together the community center that had now become the heart of the neighborhood. Yet, the idea that their work was nothing more than a way for Victor to atone for past mistakes seemed to be gaining traction. The assumption that Mia was only here because of Victor's guilt over his father's actions weighed on her like a stone. They hadn't even begun to discuss the true dynamics of their relationship with each other. And now, it seemed that the world around them was already drawing conclusions. On a Wednesday afternoon, Victor called her to his office. She knew it was going to be one of those meetings, the kind where they were bound to face another hurdle. She had been here before, sitting beside him while the outside world tried to undermine their efforts. But this time, it felt different. His voice was colder than usual when he had asked her to come. It wasn't the tone of a man asking for advice. It was the tone of someone bracing for a battle. They walked into the sleek, modern conference room at Victor's company, his team already seated around the table. They weren't just discussing business anymore. They were discussing Victor's life choices, and by extension, hers. Mia wasn't surprised by the harshness of their questions. She'd seen it coming. The higher Victor climbed, the more people wanted to tear him down. They didn't care about the community center, the children's smiles, or any of the good they had done together. All they cared about was numbers, profits, and what it meant for the bottom line. Mia took a seat at the far end of the table, her eyes fixed on the faces around her. She could see the judgment in their eyes, the whispers that had been exchanged when she walked into the room. They didn't care that she was doing something good. They cared that she was a distraction. A man in a sharp suit, one of Victor's high-ranking colleagues, leaned forward and fixed Victor with a piercing look. "Victor, we need to talk about priorities," he began, his tone icy. "You're pouring resources into these community projects. But what about the company? What about the board's expectations? You've been away from the business for weeks now." Victor didn't flinch, his expression calm, almost unreadable. "I know what you're going to say," he replied quietly. "But this is something I need to do, something that matters. More than just numbers, more than just the business." Mia could feel the tension building. She had heard Victor defend their work in the community before, but this was different. He was standing up for something bigger than business. He was standing up for her. She had never seen him quite like this before. His usual polished demeanor was gone, replaced by someone who was finally ready to fight for what he believed in. "Victor," the man across from him said again, his voice sharper now. "It's a simple question. Do you want your company, or do you want her?" He gestured toward Mia, his words dripping with condescension. Mia held her breath, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She wanted to speak, to tell them that she was no one's possession, that she wasn't a prize to be won or lost. But the tension in the room was thick, and Victor's silence spoke louder than anything she could say. She felt her pulse quicken as the room held its collective breath, waiting for his response. Victor stood up slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I don't have to choose," he said firmly. His voice was steady, but there was an undeniable edge of determination in his words. "I'm not going to choose between the company and Mia. I'm going to rebuild everything that was broken. I will make this work, not just for the business, but for something bigger than all of us." The room fell into a stunned silence. Even the man who had spoken earlier was momentarily speechless, taken aback by the boldness of Victor's declaration. Mia could see the weight of the decision settling in, the silent battle being waged between Victor's need for success and his desire to make things right. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know if Victor's decision was the right one. But she knew that in that moment, she had seen something in him that she had never seen before, a commitment to something more than money, more than power, more than personal gain. The silence stretched on, and Mia could feel the heat of all the eyes in the room on her. She wasn't sure if they expected her to speak, to offer her opinion, or if they simply wanted to watch her crumble under the pressure. But Victor had made his stand, and now, Mia realized, it was her turn. She met his eyes across the table, a simple glance that spoke volumes. He hadn't just chosen her, he had chosen to fight for the right thing, for something that mattered, for something that could change the world, and that, in itself, was enough for her. The man who had spoken earlier finally broke the silence, but his words came with an edge of defeat. "We'll discuss this further, but for now, the decision stands." Victor nodded, his expression still resolute. "Good, because I'm not backing down." As Mia stood to leave the room, she felt a strange sense of pride swell in her chest. She had expected this to be a turning point, but she hadn't realized how much it would change her own perspective on everything. Victor wasn't just standing up for her, he was standing up for a future they could build together, a future that was worth fighting for. But as they walked out of the room together, her heart still held one question. Was this truly the right decision? Would it be enough to overcome the obstacles that lay ahead the day the community center opened its doors? The streets were filled with the hum of excitement and anticipation. People from all walks of life had gathered, some curious about the new place, others eager to see what Mia and Victor had created. It was a celebration, not of riches or status, but of change. Change that had taken months to cultivate. Each brick and every beam of the center's framework, a symbol of their determination. The ribbon was cut, and the doors opened wide, not just to a building, but to a new world for many. Victor and Mia stood side by side, watching as the crowd filtered in. The smell of fresh paint and new beginnings filled the air. Children rushed in, their laughter echoing through the halls. Adults talked excitedly about the potential this place had for the community, for their future. But it was more than just a physical structure. It was a place of healing, of coming together, of overcoming the odds. Mia could hardly believe that this was the same woman who, just months ago, had stood in a darkened alley, a product of the streets, with no hope of a future. She had never imagined a life like this standing here, in the middle of a vibrant community that was no longer just about survival, but about growth. It was the kind of transformation that people dreamed of, but rarely saw come to fruition. Victor stood beside her, his usual guarded demeanor replaced with a quiet contentment. His eyes, always sharp and calculating, softened as he observed the people inside the center. They weren't just looking at a building, they were seeing something much deeper, a symbol of the possibility of redemption. Mia had seen him battle his demons, seen him work tirelessly for this moment, but it wasn't the same for him. He didn't just see a project, a success. He saw a reflection of what could happen when people chose to act out of love and not obligation. For Mia, it had never been about the success of the center alone. It was about what it represented, the bond they had forged, the trust that had grown between her and Victor, and the shared belief that love and sincerity could transform lives. The world wasn't ready to accept them as a couple, or maybe they didn't need to be accepted. What mattered was that in the corner of this small, bustling community, they had made a real difference, and that was enough. Victor turned to her, catching her eye. He didn't speak, but his gaze held something unspoken, something she had come to recognize as his own brand of quiet affection. It wasn't something that needed to be flaunted. He didn't want accolades or the praise of others. He just wanted to be with her, to have this moment, this new life with her. The evening was quiet, and as the last of the crowd began to leave, Mia and Victor lingered at the entrance, the final echoes of the day still hanging in the air. For the first time in a long time, Mia felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The community had embraced them, and though they had faced their challenges, they had come through stronger. But what she hadn't realized was that through this entire journey, she had been changing just as much as the community around her. She had let go of her fears, her distrust. She had opened her heart not just to Victor, but to the idea of believing in something greater than herself. Victor broke the silence between them with his soft voice, the words simple but profound. "I don't need fame. I just need to be a part of her world." Mia's heart caught in her chest. She knew exactly what he meant. He didn't need the recognition of the world. He didn't need to be seen as a hero or a savior. He just needed to be a part of her life. No titles, no accolades. And in that moment, she realized that she had wanted the same thing all along, to be accepted for who she was, flaws and all, to belong. But even as the warmth of his words sank into her, there was a lingering question in the back of her mind. Could they continue to hold on to these values? Could they maintain the purity of what they had built, even when the world would inevitably try to tear it apart? They had created something beautiful, but Mia couldn't help but wonder if that beauty would endure. As the last of the lights flickered off inside the center, Mia turned to look at Victor again. The quiet certainty in his eyes steadied her. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she. But together, they had created something worth fighting for. The future wasn't guaranteed, but they were willing to face it together. In the distance, the faint hum of the city continued, indifferent to the changes happening within their small corner of the world. But to Mia and Victor, it no longer mattered. They had done something real here, and that was all they needed. And then, just before they walked away from the center for the night, one of the children, the same one who had drawn pictures for Mia earlier, came up to them with a shy smile. "When is Mr. Ethan coming back?" she asked, holding out a drawing she had made of the center and its future. Victor smiled, taking the drawing with a soft nod. "He'll be here soon," he said. And Mia knew then that this moment, this simple question, marked the true beginning of their journey. But as they walked hand in hand out of the building, Mia couldn't shake the question that still echoed in her mind. Would their efforts hold? Would this change be lasting? Or would they be forgotten once the world turned its back on them? Would the love they had fought for survive? The night was still, but her thoughts were louder than ever. Would they be able to keep their promise to themselves and to the world they had just started to build? The small community center was transformed into a lively gathering spot for the evening, a celebration not just of the center's achievements, but of the relationships that had been forged within its walls. The room was filled with laughter, the hum of casual conversation, and the excited chatter of children showing their parents the art they'd created. Tables were dotted with hand-painted signs, homemade crafts, and drawings from the children, all depicting scenes of community, unity, and the bonds they had formed. Mia stood with her mother near the entrance, her gaze fixed on the room as she observed the vibrant energy around her. The contrast between the person she had been and the one she was now was stark. She had once felt like an outsider, as though she were always on the edge of something, never truly belonging. But now, as she stood in the heart of this place, surrounded by people who had become her family, she realized she had found her place. Victor, who had quietly been standing across the room, caught her gaze from the corner. He was wearing an apron, a playful, whimsical design of a cartoon figure splashed across the front. His hair was slightly messy, and his usual sharpness had softened into something more approachable, more warm. There was no air of business, no formal presentation, just the man who had once been caught up in his own world, now fully part of something much bigger. Mia's heart tightened with emotion as she took in the sight. It wasn't just about the community or the center. It was about the fact that Victor had, over time, shown up. Not just as a benefactor, but as someone who cared, someone who wasn't afraid to be part of something real and imperfect. He had gone from the man who once feared attachment to the man who was now smiling, genuinely engaged in the lives of those around him. As the evening progressed, a child approached Mia, holding a small drawing. She was a girl from one of the classes Mia had helped organize, and she handed Mia the piece of art with a shy smile. It was a picture of Mia and Victor, side by side, both smiling. The child had added hearts around them, marking them as figures of care and comfort. It was an unexpected gift, but it left Mia speechless. The simplicity of it, the purity of the gesture, reminded her of the depth of the bond they had formed with these kids and the community. "Mr. Blake," the child said, looking over her shoulder at Victor. "Where is he?" Mia turned her head toward the corner of the room, her eyes catching sight of him. Victor was laughing with a few children, his easy smile lighting up his face as he helped them hang their artwork on the walls. His role had changed so much. From the aloof, disconnected businessman he had once been, he had transformed into someone who was integral to this community, someone who was not just accepted, but loved. And in that moment, Mia realized that she had allowed herself to love him too. Not because he had come to her as a savior or a knight, but because he had come to her as a partner, someone who had seen the pain in her life and chosen to be a part of it, not to fix it, but to walk beside her. Mia didn't speak. She just let her eyes rest on him. They didn't need words in the way he held himself, the way he interacted with others. She knew what he felt, and she could feel it too, a love that had grown from respect, from shared values, from seeing each other not as what they were before, but as who they were becoming together. At that moment, a small voice broke through her thoughts. "When is Mr. Blake coming back?" It was the same child who had given her the drawing, now looking at Victor with a hopeful smile. Mia smiled softly, her hand resting on her heart. "He's already here," she said, her voice steady, filled with quiet affection. "He's already here." Victor turned toward them, his eyes catching Mia's, and they shared a brief, unspoken exchange. There were no grand declarations, no confessions of undying love. There didn't need to be. The simple truth was that they had found something worth holding on to, something that didn't require perfection, only presence. As the night continued, Mia took a moment to herself, walking outside to get some fresh air. The evening had been beautiful, but the weight of everything they had accomplished, everything they had overcome, was beginning to settle on her. She had never imagined that she would be here, in this place, at this moment. She had gone from being someone who couldn't even dream of a future to someone who was now part of a community, part of a family, and most importantly, part of something real with Victor. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill her lungs. The world outside still felt vast, but somehow it didn't seem so daunting anymore. They had created a place of belonging, a space where dreams were no longer limited by the past or by the judgment of others, and she had found herself too in the process. Victor appeared beside her, his presence warm and steady. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at her with a quiet understanding. She could feel his gaze, but it wasn't demanding, it was patient, waiting for her to speak when she was ready. And when she did speak, it was simple, but it was everything. "You stayed," she said, her voice soft, but full of meaning. Victor nodded, his hand gently brushing against hers. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." And then, as if on cue, one of the children ran up to them, excitedly holding something small in their hands. It was a gift, a little figurine of a dancer. "For you, Mia," the child said, holding it out with both hands. "I made it for you and Mr. Blake. It's you two, dancing together." Mia took the figurine in her hands, her eyes welling up with emotion. It wasn't just the figure or the gesture, it was the understanding behind it. They weren't just a couple, they were part of something larger, a movement that was about love, connection, and community. And as she looked at Victor, she knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges they would face them together. The figurine was a symbol, a token of what they had built, and as she looked at it, she felt a sense of peace settle within her. It wasn't about grand gestures or public acclaim, it was about the quiet, steady love they had nurtured, the love that had carried them through everything. As they walked back into the center, hand in hand, Mia's heart was full. They didn't need to be perfect. They just needed to keep moving forward, together. And in that moment, she realized that she had found her home, not in a building or a place, but in a person, in Victor, and that was enough. The community had begun to look at them differently now, but Mia knew that it wasn't their opinions that mattered most. It was the truth of what they had created together, the love that had sustained them, and the future they were building. She didn't need approval from anyone else. She had everything she needed right here. They weren't the same people who had started this journey, but they were still here, still fighting, still loving, and that was more than enough. As the sun set over the city, its golden light softened the edges of the day, like the quiet settling of an old wound. They stood together, not needing to say much, just sharing a moment of silence, a quiet understanding passing between them. It wasn't about erasing the past, but learning to live with it. Sometimes, it's not the grand gestures that make a difference, but the small, consistent acts of kindness that slowly rebuild trust. And so, they moved forward 2 lives, no longer defined by what had been broken, but by what they could build together, piece by piece. What happens when we choose to stay, to listen, to try again? Maybe, just maybe, it's enough to create something that's real. The city buzzed around them, but in that quiet moment, something shifted, something they couldn't name yet. And perhaps that's the most important change of all.